Welcome back, everybody, and welcome if you're joining us for the first time. I guess this is technically season 2 of the book series formerly known as NCFS in Captivity, now optimistically, aspirationally known as NCFS Unbound. We are just an evolving thing, going with the flow and the time. So as we did last year, we are presenting our recent publications and a little less frequently now that many of us are back to teaching in person. So I'm delighted to be back here with Susan McCready and Masha Belenky, who are organizing this series with me for starters. And we have a great lineup for you coming your way. So hopefully we will all see each other in October at the end of the month in DC and remind ourselves of the pleasures of actual human contact. And then we'll be so bereft, but not for long, because in November 19th, and that's a Friday, we will have our next NCFS Unbound. And that is with Kari Weil in conversation with Cheryl Krieger. So you can go ahead and register. You can register for all the things that we already have registration links for. They're going to be in the chat. And we're kind of alternating Thursdays and Fridays this year because people are back in person just to deal with everyone's schedules. So just like a quick snapshot, and then you can go on the website and you can see what else we have lined up. We have a December event, Thursday, December 16th, with Kate Griffiths and Andrew Watts in conversation with Susan Harrow about their history of French literature on film. And then we have a bunch more fabulous things happening in the spring with February, Melanie Hawthorne speaking with Gretchen Schultz. In March, we have Anne Linton, who I'll be speaking to about her book on making sex. In April, we have Literary Slumming with Eliza Jane Smith in conversation with Carolyn Butensky. So today, we will be discussing this wonderful and exciting book edited and translated by Corey Cropper and Christopher Flood, Mormons in Paris, Polygamy on the French Stage. Such an exciting set of discoveries between those book covers. So I'm excited to hear our speakers share them with you. I'll start by introducing Corey Cropper, who is professor of French at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. His book, Playing at Monarchy, Sport as Metaphor in 19th Century France, examines French literary representations of sports and games. He's also published on 19th century fantastic literature and on cycling, gambling, and poaching in French fiction. He and Seth Whitten have a book that is forthcoming next year with Bucknell, titled Velocipedamania, a cultural history of the velocipede in France. And Corey will also share news about a forthcoming volume related to the current one. I'll let him tell you about that in a few minutes. And then we have Christopher M. Flood, who is an assistant professor of French at Brigham Young University. Well, I think you're an associate professor now, yes, if I'm not mistaken. Breaking news here on the NCFS Zoom. Congratulations. And his research focuses on the unique insights offered by comedies and satires into the context that produced them. He's previously published on medieval and early modern political and religious satire. So welcome to the 19th century. And they will be speaking with Susan McCready, who is professor of French and chair of the Department of Modern and Classical Languages and Literature at the University of South Alabama. She's the author, most recently, of Staging France Between the World Wars, Performance, Politics, and the Transformation of the Theatrical Canon. And she's currently completing work on her next monograph, entitled Commemorative Acts, The Great War in French Theater.
So this book, I want to, Rachel mentioned another book that I've been working on with Daryl Lee and Heather Belknap for about a decade. And this really was a side project. And that other book, I'm happy to say, is coming out. It's called Marianne Meets the Mormons, and that'll be out with the University of Illinois Press next fall, so in a year from now. So this book just came out last year, and I want to just start with a little quote. And it's a translation. So the quotes here will be in English, but this is from Henri Rochefort's Retour de la Nouvelle-Calédonie. The French won't trouble themselves to examine Mormonism, for in our nation where ignorance flourishes, Mormons are clowns, created and put on the earth only to provide material for the playwrights who compose vaudeville comedies in Paris. And so what we did, Chris and I did, was to look at these Mormon vaudevilles, essentially. These are actually operettas. One is a footy vaudeville, the fourth one in the volume. There are 4 different operettas and plays in the book that we look at, and we translated and then tried to sort of explain the importance. And let me maybe start by just saying, I need to say that this thing would not have seen the light of day had it not been for Rachel Mesch and her help. She looked over the intro for us and gave us really valuable feedback that made this project happen. And I want to say thanks to Elizabeth Emery, to Susan, to Andrea Goulet, also Susan McCready and Andrea Goulet for their help as we went through this. But why did we decide to take on this project? Part of it was we wanted to widen the Mormon studies conversation that tends to be very Anglo-centric. Second, we wanted to sort of inception NCFS into the Mormon History Association, which is this huge group of scholars, some academics and some not, but it's really a large association. And we were happy, Chris and I, this book won an award at the Mormon History Association, the best book in international Mormon studies. And so we were happy, that was a surprise, but we were happy to sort of get people that tend to look at Mormonism from one perspective to look at it in a more global context. And that was one of our objectives. We also wanted to study the oversized role of a small foreign religion in social debates in Paris. And I'll talk a little about that. And finally, just to draw attention to what was maybe the most popular genre in France at the time, the operetta and the opéra bouffe and the folie vaudeville. And we hope that we've done that. A lot of these are not part of the canon, obviously, but I think it's really important, particularly for understanding pop culture in the 19th century. This quote from Jean Pedersen was really helpful in framing the argument. She wrote in her book on legislating the French family that the most important discussions about women's rights in the French Civil Code occurred not only in Parliament and periodical press, but also especially at the theater. And what we notice is that plays out in these operettas, and I'll talk about a couple of issues, but I also just wanted to, at the outset, show you this Retro News frequency chart of the word Mormon in the French press. And you'll notice this first peak is at the death of Brigham Young, but you can see that the French press starts covering Mormonism pretty extensively in the 1850s in the social movements and talking about Mormonism as a sort of utopian social project after their own social utopian project failed in France in 1848 and early 50s. So death of Brigham Young is here. The manifesto, this is when the LDS Church renounced the practice of polygamy in 1890. The other peak is the Smoot hearing when Utah elected an LDS senator. I remember the LDS Church as a senator, and it took them, the Senate didn't want to seat him, so those hearings were covered quite a bit in the French press. And then after the war, this is this other peak is at the publication of Pierre Benoit's novel Le Lac Salé. But getting back to the sort of social issues that are present here, in 1864, the theater in France is deregulated. And so you can have more people on stage and different types of theaters. And one of the things that I think happens, and that we talk about a little bit in the book, is that theaters began to target specific audiences. This is from Robida's novel Le XXe siècle in 1883, and it's the Théâtre des Variétés. And you can see that these are women and their dowries that are being advertised on the screen at the Théâtre des Variétés. And you can see mostly men. And the Théâtre des Variétés and the Théâtre de la Renaissance, which is another theater that housed a play or an operetta on Mormons in 1890, they targeted men, particularly single Frenchmen. And so talking about Mormons, just sort of from a really practical perspective, allowed them to get all the women in the troupe on the stage at the same time. And because of the polygamy question. So for once, I was very grateful that France censored their plays and had a censorship office, because that is where these manuscripts were collected, at least 2 of the 4 that are in our book. Mormons in Paris, we found it there, and Berthellier Meets the Mormons as well. And Mormons in Paris is interesting. The whole play is the final act of the play is is a sort of mock trial, and they're debating because Albert, the main character, has gone to study law in the US, ends up in Salt Lake, marries a handful of wives. 2 of them follow him back to Paris, and he's trying to deny he married them. And so there's a whole legal issue. And because divorce is illegal in 1874, when this operetta was on stage, he was in a conundrum and manages to get his way out of it, as they always do, right? And marry the woman that he wants to marry, the French woman he wants to marry. But it's the divorce issue seems to be front and center. Berthellier chez les Mormons, 1875, also at the Théâtre des Variétés, as Mormons in Paris was. This is really fascinating. The whole play is set in Salt Lake City. The prophet, his name is Oscar. He's a Parisian who traveled the US and then found his niche in Salt Lake and rose to the rank of prophet within a few years. And he has a whole coterie of wives who rebel against him, and they organize a revolt, in fact. And it's very Parisian, you know, at the end of, in the 1860s, as the women's movements gain a footing, what you see in this 1875 operetta is basically the French anxiety about gender roles played out writ large on the stage of Berthellier chez les Mormons. So the women, they have, just like the Code Civil, they write up various codes that stipulate that men have to behave a certain way and that they have to acknowledge the reign of women. And this is several years before, but women gained suffrage in Utah in 1870. And Robida published this in the Journal Amusant the same year. And this scene really resembles what happens in the 1875 Berthellier chez les Mormons, that operetta, where you have the women who are armed. You see the husband here is carrying nothing but a broom and is somewhat emasculated, and the women are the ones who hold the real power. And so there's this sort of uprising of women that parallels some of the questions and the satire, but also the very serious conversations happening in France in the late 1860s and early 1870s around the rights of women. Divorce is legalized in 1884. Nake actually writes about Mormonism as this, he talks about it being, and the idea of Mormon marriage a little later. But what I found really interesting, we researched the debates in the French Senate and Parliament and the Assemblée about divorce, and he continually referred to it as la polygamie, le mormonisme. That the saying that Mormons, we're gonna, if we accept divorce, we're gonna all become Mormon. And this is a theme that comes up around in the 1880s quite a bit, actually, in not only in the Senate and in the debates in the National Assembly, but in the popular press as well. The third of the works that we study is called Les Douzvam de Jafet, and here the first act is in Salt Lake, and a Frenchman named Beaujolais, who takes the name Jafet so that he can inherit the canned food empire of his predecessor, is married to 12 wives. And when he goes to leave, he leaves to go to Paris at the end of Act 1, and the wives decide, they smell a rat and they decide to follow him. So the act, or the operetta, starts in Salt Lake. And the Salt Lake, by the way, is with lush vegetation. If you've ever been to Salt Lake and you came here when we hosted NCFS some years ago, you'll know that there's not a lot of lush vegetation. But the point of reference, obviously, for French theater goers where polygamy is practiced was Africa and this sort of vague notion of the Orient. And that's transposed here. And you can see by the dress too of Jafet or Beaujolais. But so it starts in Act 1, and here's a shot or a photo of the troupe from Act One. And you notice too, look at the architecture that is very Eastern behind them. And so this Act One, they start in Salt Lake, then Act Two moves to Paris, and you can see the travel apparel of the women as they go to Paris, and then they end up getting arrested. It's, there's always a police officer in these operettas too. And then Act Three, they become very Parisian and they dress like Parisians. And because divorce is now legal in 1890, when this play comes out, or this operetta, Jafet is able to, he uses the services of a marriage office and places his wives with other husbands, and is able to go on and kind of get out of the conundrum he's in Paris in 1890. Chris, do you want to take it from here?
Sure, thanks. So the fourth of the plays that we looked at is Libby Stefano. And so this one has a lot of the same elements that you see in the other ones. This one takes place entirely in France, in Paris, but also up at the coast. And you've got a Mormon character who comes from Utah with his senior wife and 6 of his daughters. And the names are all, are all comical in and of themselves. His wife's name is Corpulencia, and all of his daughters have these kind of diminutive names: Nellie, Lucy, Betty, Jenny, Pretty, and Baby. And they come into contact in France with this other family, kind of a wealthy bourgeois named Rubino, who is having an affair with this woman named Stefana. And Stefana catches the eye of the Mormon visiting from Utah, Sir Gaveston. And she also attracts the eye of her lover's son. And so there are all sorts of strange, intersecting, overlapping relationships. And so as you follow throughout the course of the comedy, there are a lot of misunderstandings, mistaken identities, the kinds of things you would expect in kind of a farce or an operetta, comical operetta from this time period. But in the end, the resolution is really interesting, and polygamy becomes essentially the resolution for to all of the problems that arise in the story. The Stefana ends up becoming another wife of Sir Gaveston, and she's excited to do so. The Rubino's wife decides that she's going to leave him. She's threatening to leave him and and she's trying to become one of Gaveston's wives, but he's not interested in someone so old. And then Rubino's son, who had been in love with Stefana, falls in love with all 6 of Sir Gaveston's daughters and excitedly converts to Mormonism so that he can marry all 6 of them. There's this silly process outlined. He's got to wait, I think it's a few weeks in between each marriage for it to all be proper. And so there are all sorts of questions that arise here. Questions of marriage. What is it to be married? What is divorce? Monogamy, adultery. All of these are brought into this mix to create just a farcical environment. But as Corey said, and I'm really grateful to Corey for inviting me to be part of this project. As Corey said, these were all touching on important issues of the time. And in fact, so we decided that I would talk a little bit about the process of translating and what we saw here. And one of those things, the biggest thing, the biggest challenge, I guess, is, as most of you probably know, in translating comedy, is translating jokes. They are just notoriously difficult to translate, but especially in these works, because as we worked through them, as we went through them, we realized that they are much more Saturday Night Live than Gulliver's Travels. They're more engaged with their moment, with the pop culture of the moment, than they are timeless, universal satires. And in fact, I foolishly volunteered to do the footnotes, and it took a long time. It took much longer than expected because there are so many references all throughout to plays and other operas and operettas of the day. And a lot of the time, they're not even identified. A character will just sing a line and everyone will comment on it. And so you have to figure out what they're referencing. But it's interesting because there are all these inside jokes. So there's an assumption that the audience would also get these, the theater going audience, of course, would also get these references, get these jokes. And there are also some other more, I guess, elevated intertextual references. In Stefano's Jewel, for example, there's kind of a scene, a running gag relating it to Diderot's Bijoux Indiscrets. So there are references all throughout that tie it not only into literature, prior literature, or the popular operas and operettas at the time, but into the current events, which I think really supports this idea that Corey has already proposed of these operettas being a place to work through some of these concerns around marriage. So with that, these are operettas, and so they have songs, and that's another challenging aspect. Luckily, we were able to find the music, the scores for 3 of the 4, if I remember right. And we actually have a website. I'm going to share my screen, if I can, just to show you our website real quick. We've created a website where you can listen to the music. We've got all the music for Japheth's 12 Wives up there. And I'll play a little excerpt for you from the overture to give you a taste of. You can follow along for those of you who play piano there. So I'll stop there. It's a lot of fun. You can listen to the whole thing if you want. The entire show is on here. And this, as you can see, this PDF here that we've got, it's the piano score. So they actually published the piano score and vocal parts for this operetta, which would seem to indicate that it was fairly popular. And the authors and the composers, these are not unknown people. Victor Roger was a well-respected and renowned composer in the late, most of you probably know that, sorry, I'm not a 19e-iste, as was mentioned before, but was a respected composer at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And so the process, a big part of the process of translating was working on the musical parts of these plays. And so that was a lot of fun. I mean, I have to say overall, this was the most fun I've ever had working on a research project, not just because Corey's great to work with, but the material was fun to work with. And the music, you know, I just sit at the piano and plunk it out and work through lyrics. And, you know, you listen to that kind of Gilbert and Sullivan style operetta, you know, peppy music, and it just puts you in a great mood. And it really sets the scene for these lighthearted comedies that are tackling really serious issues.
So I want to thank Chris too. Chris and I, you know, all these librettos were written by 2 people. And so I was really happy to have Chris working with me on these translations. We bounce ideas off each other, and the project is definitely better because we work together on this. And so you see this last image, my daughter helped me with the Photoshop here, but just to close, in the US in the 19th century, Americans saw Mormons as the ultimate other. Looking at Mormonism was a way to define what it meant to be American by contrast. So Americans were monogamous, Mormons were polygamous. Americans were Protestant, Mormons weren't. Americans were white, Mormons, Paul Reeves' book, Religion of a Different Color, shows how in the 19th century, Mormons were coded as racially other as well. And so, but in France, it's quite the opposite. The Mormons are very French. They embody French issues, and it's sort of like, Le Cid in Spain, or any other, a lot of examples like that. Beaumarchais is another example. By setting the French problems in another country with a distant religion, it allowed these playwrights and librettists to work through some of the French issues at arm's length, and to get people laughing at some of the ridiculousness of their own social system. So anyway, we will stop there. Susan, if you want to jump in.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I'm going to assume that I'm visible, and I want to just start. First of all, congratulations on this book. Congratulations on your prize. That's fantastic. And it's well deserved. So I want to start with the idea, with the first word. I want to start with Mormon, the word Mormon. You mentioned in the notes to the book, in the notes to the introduction, that Mormon isn't really the term that we should generally use to refer to members of the LDS Church anymore, right? And yet you use it here in the book because you're not really talking about members of the LDS Church. You're talking, as you just said, about a fantasy, about a projection, about a stereotype. That's rooted, among other things, in this sort of prurient fascination with polygamy. And you talk about, in your introduction, you talk about this stereotype and how it's intimately related in the French imaginary. You just referred to it in your presentation with that earlier stereotype of the polygamist of North Africa or of the Middle East, right? The pasha in the harem, or the sheikh, or what have you. And the idea, or maybe the fantasy of polygamy, is so entwined with that sort of earlier, I associate it with Montesquieu representation, and the theory that the warmer climates are where sexual license comes from, and so forth. It's so entwined with that these French playwrights had to imagine and stage this lush tropical Utah that you referred to. They can't fathom polygamy outside that context. And yet, the stereotype of the Mormon here is really different from that of like the Middle Eastern Orientalist fantasy of the sheik that we see in other representations, starting in the 18th century and through the 19th century. And I was going to ask you to talk about that difference. So the difference in the way the two groups are sort of othered and orientalized, if you want, and with respect to two different things. So this is a very long question, and do this in whatever order you want. But on the one hand, you talk about polygamy as it relates to different 19th century concerns in French culture. So a crisis of masculinity following the Franco-Prussian War, or the movement for women's rights, or this argument for divorce law that's happening across the 60s and 70s and into the time where divorce is made legal in 1884. So on the one hand, how the social questions that the late 19th century are interested in get projected onto polygamy in a different way from, say, the earlier questions in the 18th century. Although, of course, they both share the perennial French panic about birth rates. And then on the second part of my question is, how does the differentness of these two stereotypes, how does it interact with the Americanness of Mormons? You just suggested that for Americans, Mormons were anti-American, right? But for the French, the Mormon figures are sort of ultra-American, super American in a way. So if you could talk about, I know that's a lot, if you could talk about those issues to start with, please.
Yeah, the big difference really is that the stereotypes about Muslims and Jews are older and have this kind of tragic and violent history, and Mormonism is new, so it doesn't have that, and it means that it's really easy to talk about and laugh about with no complex, right? So these operettas are like a great example of that. The French, there's an article that we found that is the title of the article. It's in the Journal Amusant, and the title is Le Surménage. And they play on that idea of being overworked, but also having a ménage that's too big. And the argument of the authors is that the real capital of surménage and polygamy is not Salt Lake, but Paris, where Parisian men have all these mistresses. And even though they're not acknowledged, that's where is really the world capital of polygamy. And so that's not a joke that you could make, about some of these other groups, but you can make it about Mormons because of their newness, because they're American and foreign, and they don't pose any kind of existential threat at all in France. I mean, obviously, the Jewish question at the end of the 19th century, there is a real existential threat, even though it's obviously overblown. They make it becomes that, where Mormonism has none of that, those kind of that baggage or that sort of weight around it. And the question about the Americanness is interesting too, because the French, in their analysis of Mormonism, flip. So they'll look at Mormonism as this, on one hand, very French in the way they represent utopia, socialism, and so on, and maybe a model even for the French to follow in some ways. That they group Mormonism with Saint-Simonien, the Fourier, and some of those other earlier utopian movements in France. But then on the other hand, they'll look at Mormonism as the ultimate example of America. 10 says that Mormons are this sort of freewheeling Protestant movement, and that as a society, we thought we were reasonable, but he writes, on a lâché le fou. We've let the fool, the crazy out of the box, or the jester, right, is another way to translate that. But and there's another play, 1890, same year as Jafet's 12 Wives, that called Camille. It was a one-act play performed at the Comédie Française at Théâtre National, and it features a Mormon character, a couple of Mormon characters. And in that, there's a Mormon character named Murphy, who shows up. He's always got a pistol. He's always threatening violence. He's sort of this ultimate American, right? And what Americanness allows him to do, though, is to be flexible. It's like, and Mormonism in that play called Camille, it's the 27th variety of Mormonism that can be changed at any time to meet people's needs. So America and the Americanness of Mormonism means that it's very flexible and malleable and can adapt to whatever situation is necessary in the French context.
And I would add to that, just talking about the stereotypes of Mormons in these plays, that there is an emphasis on capitalism and kind of the free market and the wealth of America. And a couple of the plays, the Mormon characters that come back are very wealthy. Whether it's the Frenchman who's posing as who assumes the identity essentially of the canned food magnate in America, or Sir Gaveston, who's an inventor and who has come to France trying to market this new invention that can detect sincerity in a potential lover. And so there's definitely an emphasis on the kind of tycoons, the magnates, the capitalism, the burgeoning capitalism and culture of capitalism in America.
I wonder if you can tie that also into the question of colonialism, because you touch on that in your introduction a little bit, mostly in relation to Robida's novel more than to the plays. But there you talk about a kind of, it's as if Robida is positing a kind of inclusive colonial project where you can have a wife from all the different cultures and everyone can live in peace and harmony, right? And at the same time, I think in that's also a novel in which do I have this right? In which Brigham Young actually kidnaps the main character and hands him over to the Apache, right? So you have on this American landscape that is a colonial enterprise at the same time. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, in fact, it just so happens that I'm teaching Robida today.
Oh, super.
And I'm sorry I don't have like great images to show you, but I'm going to hold this up, and I don't know if it's not great, but this is Brigham Young is sending telegrams to Robida's character Satyona, and offering them wives. And what's interesting, to go back to kind of what Chris was saying, these are, first of all, you notice they're racialized, but in addition, the terms used to describe them are les épouses de Mandibule, premier lot. So here's the batch of wives, and the wives are always numbered. They talk about them being numbered. Now, in practice, Chris might know a source, but in actual Mormon LDS polygamy, I never heard of that happening in the old days. But in all the French versions, there is this, they number the wives. It's kind of military-like, and the women are somehow kind of commodified. And here is, again, I apologize for this is Faundul's arriving at the docks and in Salt Lake. And you can see that the African Black women are down here off of the main dais and somewhat marginalized. But I have to show you one other image. And again, apologies for we did find this in color for the other book, but this is Satyona taking roll call of his wives. There's a portrait of Brigham Young on the wall behind them. But again, you can see there's this almost idea of a kind of, not ideal, but a racial harmony that exists in the Mormon enterprise that doesn't exist in the French colonial system. Right. The big difference there, of course, is that the French colonial system is maintained through the use of military might, where in Mormonism, at least in Robida's mind, it's through familial ties of love and voluntary love, I don't know, but familial ties in any case, and people voluntarily coming to the center instead of the colony going out and taking over other, or the colonizers taking over colonies. Is that?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I want to ask you too about, form too, because I think, we think about, so as a theater person, you think about comedy is from at least Molière, is always about marriage, right? It's always about marriage. And so to what extent can you say that these plays, and I know these are commercial plays, these are not avant-gardist, plays that are trying to push the form. But at the same time, to what extent can we say these plays, in offering an alternative view of marriage and different possibilities of marriage, are also pushing the comedic form in new directions? I think the Bijou de Stefano is the one that would bear that out best.
Yeah, and Chris, do you want to tackle that one?
Sure, I'll do my best. So as mentioned, I'm not a 19e-ist. And
you are now, Chris.
Honorary, at least. I appreciate
one of us.
So in fact, this week I'm reading some early modern works with my students in a class that talk a lot about similar topics. They're comedies or satires that deal with marriage and trying to define marriage and what happens when you don't like your spouse anymore, or when you accidentally get married off to the wrong person. There's one story that I read with them where two couples, the curé is blind, they're in a dark church, the women are wearing veils, and he accidentally marries the women to the wrong men. And it's an older couple and a young couple, and everyone's miserable except for the older man who has this young, beautiful wife now. And the story ends with, well, we've written to the Pope, we've written to the bishop, we haven't gotten an answer, so we don't know what to do yet. And there's this anxiety about marriage that goes back to the Middle Ages, and that shows up in these comedic and satirical works. And so I think here, where you look at the traditional definition of comedy as ending with a marriage, or this kind of movement of inclusion, that the inclusion here, it's much larger. It's not just merging two families. In the case of, Bijou de Stefano, you're merging several families together into this new community, and people are actually moving. They're leaving France and moving to the States to be able to live in this new community. And so I do think that it is pushing kind of the boundaries of what comedy is, traditionally speaking, and reassessing, along with family and society, reassessing what we can laugh at and what we can work with in terms of comedy and satire.
And if I could just quickly add, Jafet's 12 Wives, 1890, the resolution is he divorces all of his wives. So it like works in reverse. And I think that's really a clever play on the traditional comedy structure.
And I love that one because he's working with an agency, right, to unload his wives, so to speak, on other men. And I can't help, when reading that one, I couldn't help but think about, all the different ways that people meet and get together now, with apps and, how there's still this kind of, this insertion of business and commodification of relationships and love.
Yeah. Swipe left. I think,
right.
Or do you swipe right? I don't know. I'm a married person. I don't know about that.
Yeah. But just really quick, Susan, Dominique Khalifa, may he rest in peace, but we used his work on the marriage agencies, and it was terrific. So that's sort of another one of those angles that comes out in the book.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think another thing I want to ask you about is this question of honesty and hypocrisy, because that's sort of a key issue in the divorce debates. You say that, as you just said, the real center of polygamy is Paris, because we're hypocrites about marriage, right? Whereas the Mormons are seen as honest dealers. They're sincere. They may be the fool, they may be the jester, they may be this element of chaos that's unleashed, but they're honest, like the fool, right, who speaks truth to power. And that's also one of the key sources of comedy and traditional comedy, the idea of exposing hypocrisy. And sometimes it can be done really safely, and other times it becomes a very sort of a dangerous and controversial source of comedy. But your plays, the plays you're looking at, are all really, they're really commercial, right? So how do they negotiate that gotcha of revealing the hypocrisy and still appealing to a broad audience?
Yeah,
and that's also the part of the plot in Stefano, right? In the Bijou de Stefano, is that the bijou will reveal when you're actually telling the truth about whether you're in love or not.
Right. Yeah.
And it can't be sold in the United States because apparently Americans are honest.
That's right. They're too forthright, but the French will lie about anything.
That's why he's coming to France, where he's going to make a fortune selling that, right? Okay.
Yeah, one of the ironies, parenthetically, about that character, Sir Gaveston, his first name is Napoleon. Sir Napoleon Gaveston, he's the American. And
right.
Anyway, but the hypocrisy issue that goes back though to the 1860s. Olympe Baudoin, the proto-feminist who was advocating for women's rights in Paris, visited Salt Lake, and she was expecting to see these sort of dire conditions, and in fact, she saw people that were pretty happy. And she goes back and gives these public lectures in 1869 on Mormonism. Robida's going to skewer her, of course, because he skewers everybody. But that her big argument is that in France, there's this level of hypocrisy because men and women have lovers outside of marriage, and the big issue too, and this is one of the reasons Naquet's divorce law kept coming back, is because children from these illegitimate unions weren't recognized and ended up in poverty, wards of the state, and so on. And Baudoin is able to say, look, this we kind of recoil in horror in the same way Montaigne's people reading about the cannibal recoil in horror, but in fact, in the same way the cannibals in Montaigne's version are more honest and forthright about religion, and than the French are, or the Europeans are. Mormons are more forthright and honest about family and relationships than we are.
And then, I mean, if you look at not just the Bijou and Bijou de Stefano, but in all of the other plays, if I remember right, there are multiple characters that are trying to pass as someone else, whether it's someone who is, excuse me, pretending to be devout, pretending to be the prophet, the leader of the Mormons, or pretending to be someone's daughter. I mean, every single play, someone is lying, someone is pretending to be something they're not, and they're all revealed in the end. And you can find a certain resonance with certain critiques that you would find in France of the political establishment, of the church, of the clergy. But there's definitely an aspect to this, you know, a core aspect of all of these comedies is unveiling the, you know, the deceitfulness, the, you know, unveiling the dishonest characters, revealing who they really are. In most cases in these plays, they're comedies, and so it works out somehow. You know, and everyone lives happily ever after, you know, with as many wives as they choose, but
or as few.
as few.
Yeah.
But it's it definitely there's this unmasking of.
Well, let me interrupt you to bring up then melodrama, because you mentioned that there are Anglophone, particularly British, I think, or also American melodramas in which the Mormon character and the idea of polygamy is dangerous and destructive, and, you know, and of course melodramas are always about unmasking the bad guy and so forth. So could you talk a little bit about that contrast, the Franco comic side versus the Anglo melodramatic take on Mormon?
Yeah, those were actually American anti-Mormon melodramas, and there were some in the UK too, because there were a number of people from the UK that converted to the LDS faith and left the UK, left England to go to Salt Lake. But yeah, they tended, the Mormon characters in that are always the villains. They're out to steal the wives, and they're eventually unmasked. Most of the Mormon characters in these plays are actually French, you know, and they fit in with French middle class values. They and so in the same way that the Americans are trying to other Mormons, the French in these plays as well try to show more. They tend to underscore similarities more, and that's the case with the melodrama in America versus these operettas in France.
Yeah, I think the melodramas show that there's a sense of danger, right? That we're going to lose, our daughters are going to be taken off, you know, by these communities, whereas there's just not that sense of danger, not that kind of urgency in France.
I guess my last, we're going to have to wrap pretty soon here. So I just wanted to ask you to talk a little bit more. Chris, you talked about it in the presentation, but can you talk a little bit more about the audiences of these plays and the theaters in which they were performed? You talked about it in part in relationship to the translation, right? You want to translate these plays so that, and I think you succeed actually in your translations. I think that your translations succeed in striking the right tone, the right level of language, so that we get the sense of what the audiences for these plays were like. This isn't high canonical drama. This isn't cutting edge, avant-gardist something. These are mainstream plays, and I think you do that really well. But can you talk a little bit more about the audiences?
Yeah, so two of these were at the Théâtre des Variétés, which is one of the old, established and officially recognized theaters in Paris. And you can tell that at least Robida, when he wrote the 20e siècle, viewed that as a place where bachelors would go. And of course, that's the same theater as where Nana, Zola's Nana is in Théâtre des Variétés. So there's this idea of sort of objectifying women, and so putting a whole raft of polygamous wives on stage kind of fits with that. The Renaissance theater is similar. That actually Offenbach inaugurated that one, but it tended to, and if you've been to the Renaissance theater to this day, it has the sculptures and so on all are hew toward the erotic and the exotic.
Mhm.
And so this Jafet's 12 Wives fits in there perfectly. The other one was at the El Dorado and at the Théâtre de Cluny that did kind of experimental plays, and that is the only theater of the three that is no longer in service today, or doesn't work. But I think the audience, primarily, that's the audience, right? Middle class, single men. And there were also some operettas from the same time. One that I worked on with some students last semester called Joséphine vendue par ses sœurs. It's like a female version of the Joseph sold into slavery thing, but here it's an operetta singer who sold out of Paris into this miserable existence in a harem. So all of those, what they share in common is getting women on stage, and preferably women that are clad in a way that excites the male viewer's interest.
Well, thank you. Well, I think this book is going to excite a lot of readers' interest. So let's call it at that. Thank you so much for talking with us today. Thanks for participating. We didn't get to questions in the chat, but what we're going to do now is close it down and ask everybody to turn their cameras back on and their mics back on, and we can have a casual conversation that way. So thank you so much
Thanks, Susan.
for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you.